Now let's move on to today's perspective. And my guest today is a climate activist who's seen firsthand the effects of climate change. Abigael Kima's family paid tuition fees to send her away from hometown of Iten in the west of Kenya to secondary school so she could get a proper education. And when she returned home, though, she saw the dramatic change that climate change had on her family and friends at home. And since then, she's become a real climate activist. She even has her own climate podcast. It's called the Hali Hewa, a Swahili term for climate, and she spoke as well recently at the recent COP27 summit in Egypt, and she joins us now from Nairobi. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme. I'd like to start off by asking you about your roots and that change that you found on your family and friends at home. Tell us a bit more about what happened while you were away and what the change was.
Thank you so much for having me this morning. So I come from a community of farmers. We practice agriculture as a main source of livelihood. And over the years, a lot has changed owing to the climate crisis. I personally grew up in a farm, and we used to have a stream that cut across our farm, which was able to supply water to irrigate the farm. But then, thanks to encroachment in the forest, which was close by, some of our neighbors were encroaching the forest to expand their land for agriculture, and so it meant the stream in our farm completely dried up. And then apart from that, we used to follow a specific calendar of planting. For example, we knew that by February you need to start preparing your land because you're expecting short rains. But then I'd give an example of this year, particularly by the time we were celebrating Easter in April, we had not even planted because there were no rains. So that change, and without that level of education, it means farmers kept losing their crops either to extreme lack of water because there are no rains, or extreme rainfall that would then again wash away their crops that were still yet to grow. So that's the kind of change that I've seen. And as you mentioned in the introduction, I was able to go to school because of agriculture. So it has ripple effect on education. It has a ripple effect on people's livelihoods. And that's sort of the change that I saw firsthand at home.
Why did that kind of spur you, if you like, to do what you're doing, to use that education to do the podcast that you do and to take the action that you take on a daily basis?
So I quickly realized that the level of climate literacy was a bit low, and people only act from a point of information. And I thought it was really important to create the level of awareness that we are doing now. Of course, not many people from the rural area that I come from actually listen to podcasts, but it was a good starting point for me to sort of just create awareness around these issues, because climate change, of course, at the moment affects almost all sectors. And my first step was to create this awareness, make people understand why this conversation is important for them, because at some point it's getting to us. I come from a county that practices agriculture, but there are other parts of the country that is experiencing drought. And I had a chance to visit that place and see just how bad the conditions are for these people. And when you ask them about their experiences, they actually think it's an act of God or a punishment or a curse. And you see, when they're not able to articulate or rather pinpoint their experiences to climate change, then it means they're not aware of the steps that they can take to say adapt or mitigate any further impacts of climate change. So for me, it was just a step towards creating awareness, and then now with that sort of information, they're able to act towards mitigating or adapting to the impacts of climate change.
Why is it so important, do you think, to reach those people? Because African nations, certainly relatively speaking, are not very big polluters, are they? But then again, of course, this is going to affect Africa to an enormous extent, perhaps more than other nations.
As you've said, it's quite important because we know that historically we are only responsible as a continent for 0.5% of the emissions, and now less than 4% of the global emissions. But we are vulnerable in the sense that the impacts of climate change are already here with us. And when we have a target of, say, 1.5, at already 1.1, we are seeing such immense impacts. We had so many people losing their lives in Uganda owing to floods. Here in Kenya, we have people who've not seen rain for the past 2 years. They don't have food, they don't have water. They can't literally take their kids to school. And then now having these conversations for us is important because they're able to understand that, hey, this is happening to us. We haven't contributed much, but here are the policies and frameworks in place, and it is important to raise our voice so that we get justice, because at the end of the day, when we look at this whole concept, it draws back to justice. It draws back to climate justice, being that we haven't contributed much to the climate crisis, but we are vulnerable in the sense that we're already feeling the impact. And also, in case of a climate disaster, we are not able to recover as fast as, say, nations in the global north can. So just having that conversation and making them understand the concept of climate justice, yeah.
How much do you think what you do, and obviously what many other people do in speaking out, of a difference do you think it makes? I mean, you mentioned earlier, for example, the podcasts obviously are not listened to by a lot of people, particularly in the area where you come from. You also spoke at COP27. I know you talked about smoke and mirrors and people there talking a lot but not actually doing enough.
So oftentimes when we speak about climate change, we describe it with numbers, statistics that look so far from our human experiences. But what I tried to do with the podcast, which basically tries to tell stories of Africa with regards to the climate crisis. And so I noticed very quickly that people relate easily to things that are close to them. For example, in one of the episodes, I'd have a conversation with someone who's working directly with farmers. And if someone who is in the space listens to that, can easily relate to that, because that is what they do at home. So the aspect of the whole point of starting this podcast and this storytelling was to put a face to the climate crisis, because I believe for a long time when we describe it with numbers and you don't see examples of people going through it, then you don't really feel the need to act. So my aim is to actually touch policymakers from a human perspective. And how this happens, sometimes as a person, I am not able to reach every person that I want. So in the long run, I've had to collaborate with other platforms that can reach policymakers. And that's how I was actually able to make that keynote speech at COP27 to talk about accountability, in the sense that we are always making new promises in all these climate conferences. But what happens when you go back home? Nobody is following up. Nobody is acting upon it. Nobody is reporting to the authorities that they're supposed to report to, because now it's like, why should we feel the need to come make new promises when we haven't even acted on the ones that we promised before? So that's the whole idea.
Great to talk to you on the programme today. Nice and inspirational. Thanks very much for joining us. That's Abigail Kima joining us there from Nairobi. And her climate podcast is called Hali Hewa, Swahili term for climate. You'll find it, of course, online. So do look it up if you're interested in all of that.